In the 1980s, the world marveled at the dazzling rhinestone-encrusted jackets. Each piece was a shimmering masterpiece, draped over the shoulders of icons: Michael Jackson, Dolly Parton, even Mr. T. These weren't just fashion statements. They were the pinnacle of pop culture style, coveted by millions. But behind every glimmering stitch, beyond every sparkling stone, lurked a darkness few could imagine. Tucked away in the remote backwoods of Arkansas, far from the spotlight, a man named Tony Alamo built an empire born of faith, fueled by fashion, and sustained by fear. Tony Alamo wasn't just any preacher. He was a master of manipulation, a man who could spin dreams into nightmares with terrifying ease. He promised salvation to his followers, but what he delivered was something far more sinister. Those iconic jackets? They weren't crafted in glamorous workshops. They were made by the hands of children. Children forced to work long, grueling hours, knowing nothing but toil, suffering, and terror, all in the name of God, or so they were told. Welcome to Cults Uncovered. This is the rise and fall of the Alamo Christian Foundation cult, the empire Tony Alamo built on the backs of the vulnerable, and the lives he shattered in his pursuit of power. Get ready to dive into one of America's most shocking cults. Before we dive into this disturbing story, a word of caution. What you're about to hear involves serious crimes against children. It's not an easy story to tell, but it's one that needs to be heard. So let's turn back the clock and see how it all began. With two people searching for their big break in Tinseltown. It's 1966, and the streets of Hollywood are buzzing with the sounds of rock and roll and the dreams of stardom. Amidst this glittering backdrop, we meet Bernie Lazar Hoffman, a man with ambitions as big as his ego. Born in 1934 to a Jewish family in Joplin, Missouri, Bernie's early life was anything but glamorous. At the age of 9, abandoned and left at Father Flanagan's Boys Town, he endured a harsh childhood, bullied simply for being Jewish. But Bernie wasn't the type to stay down for long. He was a hustler, determined to carve out his own path. He set his sights on the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. He tried his hand at everything, singing, managing a health club, even claiming he was once asked to manage legendary bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. None of it worked out, but failure wasn't in Bernie's vocabulary. He kept dreaming, kept scheming, always reaching for that next big thing. Enter Edith Opel Horn, born in 1925 in Alma, Arkansas. Like Bernie, she had big dreams of Hollywood, but her journey was no easier. Raised Christian despite her Jewish roots, she'd been married twice, had a daughter, and still hadn't cracked the code to fame. Hollywood, as it does to many, had turned its back on her. But Edith found a different route to the spotlight, one not paved by casting agents but by religious fervor. Inspired by the famous evangelist Amy Semple McPherson, Edith reinvented herself as a traveling preacher, spreading her own gospel to the masses. Bernie and Edith, two hustlers, both looking for their big break. When they met, it was like a match made in, well, not heaven exactly, but their fantasy was close enough. They saw in each other the perfect partner for their grand ambitions. In 1966, they tied the knot in Las Vegas and decided to reinvent themselves. Bernie Lazar Hoffman became Tony Alamo, and Edith Opel Horn became Susan Alamo. The stage was set for their greatest performance yet. Instead of fame, the Alamos turned to faith, street preachers targeting the lost souls of Hollywood, the addicts, the homeless, the desperate. They were ripe for conversion, and Tony and Susan's message was fiery, filled with apocalyptic warnings, with a healthy dose of conspiracy theory thrown in for good measure. By 1969, they made their religious empire official, founding the Alamo Christian Foundation. On the surface, it seemed like they were doing good, offering food, shelter, and a sense of belonging to those who had nothing. But beneath that shiny exterior lurked something far more sinister. The Alamos had a knack for showmanship and knew how to draw a crowd. They launched a TV show, using the airwaves to rail against Catholicism, preach about the end of the world, and spin wild conspiracies about how the Vatican secretly controlled the US government, the UN, and even the media. Oh, and those UFO sightings? Clearly messages from heaven. It was bizarre stuff, but people were captivated. The Jesus freaks, as their followers called themselves, were devoted, eating up every word the Alamos fed them. The promise was simple: follow Tony and Susan's strict rules, and you'd find salvation. No drugs, no homosexuality, no birth control, no abortions. Oh, and one more tiny little thing. Hand over all your money and property to the church. In exchange for giving up everything, followers got shelter, food, and the promise of eternal life. Sounds like a sweet deal, right? Obviously it wasn't. But for people searching for comfort in an America swept up in hippie chaos, this felt like a good deal. But for those inside the Alamo Christian Foundation, life was anything but heavenly. The stage was set, but Tony and Susan's empire was built on something far darker than anyone could have imagined. As the 1970s rolled around, the Alamos decided Hollywood was getting a bit too hot for them. Too many questions, too many prying eyes. So in 1975, they packed up their growing flock and moved to Susan's old stomping grounds in Arkansas. There, in the small town of Alma, far from the bright lights and nosy authorities, the Alamo Christian Foundation really began to take shape. They built a compound, complete with a printing facility, a school, and a tabernacle. They claimed to run a drug rehab program, but in reality, it was more like a brainwashing boot camp. And then there were the businesses. Yes, the businesses. See, the Alamos had stumbled onto something big. They had a workforce that would work for free, believing they were serving God. And Tony, well, he had a flair for fashion. He started a business making denim jackets, but not just any jackets. These were airbrushed designs, Swarovski crystals, and more sparkle than a disco ball. And he found the perfect group of clients to use them, the celebrities. They couldn't get enough of them, they were virtually everywhere. Michael Jackson wore one on the cover of his Bad album. Dolly Parton, Mike Tyson, Brooke Shields. If you were anybody in the 80s, you wanted an Alamo jacket. They were selling for up to $600 a pop in fancy stores across the country. And every cent? It went straight into the Alamo's pockets. But who was making them? Well, to answer that, we have to go straight to this converted restaurant in Alma, Arkansas. Inside, it's a hive of activity. Men, women, and children. Yes, children, working up to 14 hours a day. There were up to 150 people working here. The air is thick with bleach fumes from the stonewashing drums. At one station, kids are using their small fingers to set tiny rhinestones, their hands sometimes bleeding from the work. But they don't complain. They've been told this work is for God. And just like that, Tony Alamo was building a fashion empire. At one point, there were nearly 500 children born into the cult, and Tony had them working as soon as they could coordinate their movements. They eventually grew to have the biggest country and western clothing store in Nashville. They were into trucking, real estate, you name it. The money was rolling in, and Tony Alamo was living large. Fancy cars, expensive clothes, he had it all. Meanwhile, his followers were dumpster diving for food and only allowed to flush the toilets a few times a week to save money. How did Tony Alamo maintain this labor force of devoted followers, working long hours in poor conditions? Through fear. Tony convinced his followers that if they left the church, they'd go to hell. He preached that the outside world was evil, that only he could protect them from eternal damnation. He controlled every aspect of their lives, who they could marry, how they should raise their kids, even how often they could use the bathroom. And for those who dared to question or disobey, the punishment was severe and often public, creating an atmosphere of absolute fear. Children as young as 6 were beaten with wooden paddles for minor infractions, like holding hands with other girls on the compound. One former member, Benjamin Risha, recalls seeing his 11-year-old friend beaten until he passed out, but the paddling continued, even as the boy lay unconscious. Risha's story is just one of many. Jessica Cooper, another former member, described the psychological toll of life in the cult. Alamo used sleep deprivation, isolation, and psychological manipulation to keep his followers in line. He told them that if they left, they would go to hell. For many, especially those born into the cult, the outside world was too terrifying to contemplate. And more important, on the surface, it might have seemed idyllic. Children played on trails, families lived together in a tight-knit community. Nobody could have imagined what was really going on. Life in the compound was nothing short of a nightmare. In 1982, something happened that would change everything. Susan Alamo, the co-founder and the more stable half of the leadership, died of breast cancer. And Tony spiraled. He kept Susan's embalmed body on display for 6 months, convinced she would rise from the dead. When she didn't, he blamed his followers for not praying hard enough. With Susan gone, Tony Alamo's worst tendencies came to the forefront. He became more paranoid, more violent, and more fixated on young girls. He declared that God had told him he could take multiple wives. And here's where we need to take a deep breath, because what comes next is truly horrifying. Tony Alamo, the man who claimed to speak for God, started marrying girls as young as 9 years old. He would later claim that consent is puberty, and that God had impregnated Mary when she was about 11. It's sickening stuff, and it went on for years. But while all this was happening behind closed doors, the Alamo Christian Foundation was still growing. They had churches in Nashville, Chicago, Brooklyn, and Miami Beach. The jackets were more popular than ever. From the outside, it looked like a success story. A rags-to-riches tale of a street preacher who made it big. However, cracks were starting to show. In the late 80s and early 90s, former members started speaking out. They talked about the abuse, the forced labor, the child brides. Slowly but surely, the authorities started to take notice. In 1991, the federal government finally took action. Agents raided the Alamo compound in Arkansas. But Tony had been preparing for this for years. He'd been preaching for years that the government was the enemy, that his battle with the IRS was really a war against the devil. When the feds arrived, Alamo and his inner circle were nowhere to be found. He fled, taking Susan's body with him, and evaded capture for 2 years. Even while on the run, he continued running his businesses, faxing jacket designs from his hideouts to the factory in Alma. In an interview from 1989, he bragged, "The clothing is so groovy, everyone wants it no matter what they think I am. No matter what, the superstars are going to want my jackets." And you know what? He was right. Even as the accusations piled up, tax evasion, crime against children, polygamy, people kept buying those jackets. They were selling for hundreds of dollars in boutiques on Melrose Avenue and in upscale stores across the country. But the law finally caught up with Tony Alamo in 1993. He was arrested and charged with tax evasion. In 1994, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The IRS seized his properties and auctioned off his assets, including hundreds of those famous jackets. However, this wasn't the end of the Alamo Christian Foundation. Even from prison, Tony maintained control over his followers. And when he was released in 1998, he quickly went back to his old ways, reestablishing his church and continuing to preach his twisted version of the gospel. The fact that he got caught only made him a bit more paranoid, and it also convinced some of his followers even more that the persecution was a government conspiracy. And so, things went on for a few more years. The child brides, the forced labor, the terrible living conditions for the members of the church. Everything continued without major changes until 2008, when federal agents raided Alamo's compound once more. This time they weren't just looking for evidence of tax evasion or labor violations. They were investigating claims of child exploitation and misconduct toward them. And they did find evidence. Multiple girls, some as young as 8 years old, testified that Alamo had taken them as wives and taken advantage of them. They described secret wedding ceremonies, followed by Alamo taking them across state lines to be intimate. The trial that followed was a media sensation. Alamo's victims, now young women, bravely took the stand to describe the abuse they had suffered. Their testimony was heart-wrenching and infuriating. They spoke of childhoods stolen, of trauma that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Alamo, for his part, remained defiant to the end. He claimed he was being persecuted for his religious beliefs. He ranted about government conspiracies and the impending end times, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 2009, Tony Alamo was convicted on 10 counts of transporting minors across state lines for sexual purposes. He was sentenced to 175 years in prison. It was, effectively, a life sentence for the 74-year-old Alamo. Unfortunately, that's not the end of this story. Even with Alamo behind bars, the survivors of his abuse still had a long road ahead of them. Many struggled with PTSD, with substance use, with building normal lives after years of indoctrination and trauma. And to make it worse, they had to see those infamous jackets become collector's items. Vintage Alamo jackets can sell for hundreds, even thousands of dollars. Celebrities like Miley Cyrus and A$AP Rocky have been spotted wearing them, probably unaware of the dark history behind their flashy designs. Finally, in 2017, Tony Alamo died in prison at the age of 82. For many of his victims, his death brought a sense of relief, but it didn't erase the pain of what they had endured. Today, the Alamo Christian Foundation is no more, but for some of his former members, it's a tough scar to heal. What do you think about the Alamo cult? Do you think celebrities are right to keep rocking these Alamo outfits given its history? Let us know in the comment section. If you liked this story, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our next videos. Check out our other cult stories by clicking the card on the screen. Always remember, beware the leader and never drink the Kool-Aid.